The living room felt smaller than usual that Sunday afternoon. Every chair was filled. Aunties in their best wrappers. Uncles with serious faces. Cousins pressed against the walls. My parents had called a family meeting, and everyone had come, because when my father summoned people, they came. I sat in the middle of it all, my hands resting quietly in my lap. My name is Nora Adeyemi. I am 31 years old. I had spent those 31 years trying to be exactly what this family needed: obedient, quiet, present, giving. I had sent money home every month for 4 years. I had skipped holidays I wanted, said no to opportunities that would have taken me too far, shrunk myself to fit inside the shape they preferred. None of that was mentioned that afternoon. What was mentioned was money. A specific amount. A specific disagreement. A specific moment where I had said, quietly and calmly, that I could not give what they were asking for, because I did not have it to give. My father stood up first. His voice was the kind of calm that is more frightening than shouting. "You're selfish," he said. "You are ungrateful. You are no longer our child." My mother nodded. Then she looked at me with eyes I did not recognize and said, "You'll regret this silence." I said nothing. The room waited. I kept saying nothing. I left 20 minutes later. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry in the hallway or pause on the front step waiting for someone to call me back. I picked up my bag from beside the chair where I had placed it when I arrived, walked through the living room without looking at anyone, and let myself out through the front door. The street outside was ordinary. A neighbor's radio played something cheerful from an upstairs window. A child on a bicycle wobbled past. The world had not noticed that anything significant had just happened. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the road and sat on the bench. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Not from my brother Femi. Not from my sister Amaka. Not from any of the aunties or uncles who had been sitting in that room watching my father erase me from the family record like a name crossed out in pencil. The bus came. I got on. I paid my fare. I found a seat by the window and watched the streets move past in the early evening light. My mother's last words followed me onto that bus and sat beside me the whole ride home. "You'll regret this silence." I turned those words over carefully in my mind, the way you turn something over to check for damage. I didn't feel regret. I felt something much quieter and much more useful. 3 days later, I went to the bank. I had a joint savings account that my father had insisted on when I first started working. "It's for emergencies," he had said at the time, his voice warm and reasonable. "Family security. Just in case." I had agreed because I was 26 and still believed that my parents' requests came from love rather than strategy. I had been depositing into that account for 4 years. The balance, the last time I checked, was substantial. Not a fortune, but real money. Money I had earned in early mornings and late nights, and weekends spent working instead of resting. The teller looked at her screen for a long moment after I gave her my account details. Then she looked up at me with an expression that people use when they have to deliver news they didn't create. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "this account was emptied 11 days ago. A full withdrawal was processed by the primary account holder." I kept my face very still. 11 days ago, I repeated. "Yes, ma'am." I thanked her. I stepped away from the counter. I sat in one of the waiting chairs near the door and stared at the floor tiles for a moment. Then a different officer, who had overheard, came and sat beside me quietly. "This was planned weeks ago," he said, his voice low. "The paperwork came in stages." I sat with that information for a long time. Not in the bank. I left after a few more minutes, thanking the officer who had been kind enough to tell me the truth. But I carried the information with me, and I sat with it properly that evening, alone in my apartment, with a cup of tea I made and forgot to drink. 11 days before the family meeting, my father had emptied the account. The meeting, the public disowning, my mother's words, my father's declaration, had happened 11 days after the money was already gone. This meant the fight was not the beginning. The fight was the ending. Everything that happened in that living room, the relatives, the formal language, the witnesses, had come after the financial decision was already complete. They had removed the money first. Then they had removed me. I thought about the weeks before the meeting. My father calling to ask about my income. My mother asking questions about my current job that had seemed like normal conversation. Femi mentioning casually that my parents had visited their own lawyer about family finances. I had heard all of these things and understood none of them, because I had believed that when my parents asked questions, it was because they were interested, not because they were preparing. The fight wasn't the cause of anything. It was the cover for everything. Within 2 weeks, the family narrative was fully built and running. I know this because my cousin Zara, the one person in the extended family who seemed to operate with a conscience, sent me a series of screenshots on a Thursday evening with a short message that said only, "I thought you should know what's being said." I read through them slowly. According to the story circulating through family WhatsApp groups and Sunday gatherings, I had stolen money from my parents. I had been skimming from the joint account for years. I had disrespected my father at the family meeting, shouted at my mother, and stormed out. I had abandoned my family in their time of need because I was too focused on my own life and my own comfort to care about the people who had raised me. There were embellishments I won't repeat. Details designed to make me sound not just wrong but dangerous. Not just ungrateful, but corrupt. I read every message. I looked at every screenshot. Then I put my phone face down on my kitchen table and sat quietly for a while. I did not post a response. I did not call anyone to correct the record. I did not ask Zara to defend me or send countermessages into the group chats. I simply noted what they were doing and filed it carefully in my mind under a category I was beginning to label: evidence. The lies were loud. My silence was louder. To understand what happened that Sunday, you have to understand what the years before it looked like. Money in my family was never just money. It was language. It was the way approval was given and withdrawn. When I was 19 and needed school fees, my father paid them, but the payment came with a list of behaviors expected in return. When I was 23 and needed help with rent during a difficult month, my mother helped, but she mentioned it at every family gathering for the following year, in front of whoever was present, as evidence of my dependence and her generosity. Support was never quiet. It was always announced. And the announcement always came with a bill. Not a financial bill. Something more expensive. Obedience. Silence on topics they preferred silent. Agreement with decisions I sometimes disagreed with. Presence at events I was not asked to attend, but informed I would be attending. I had paid that bill for years without fully understanding that I was paying it, because it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like family. It felt like love. It took me until that Thursday evening, reading Zara's screenshots, to trace the pattern all the way back to its beginning and see it clearly for the first time. Money was not how they showed love. Money was how they showed ownership. And I had stopped being ownable. 2 months after the family meeting, I made a decision. I had been approached through my work. I manage accounts for a mid-sized logistics company to help review some financial documentation for a client whose situation was complex. As part of that process, I spent several weeks working closely with financial records of various kinds. It sharpened my eye considerably. I used that sharpened eye to look more carefully at what I could find about my family's finances. Not because I wanted to cause harm, because I needed to understand the full picture of what I had been living inside. What I found took me several evenings to fully process. My father's import business, which he described to relatives as thriving, carried loans from 3 separate lenders. 2 of those loans were significantly overdue. There was a property, land in the village that had been referenced at family meetings as the family security, that had been used as collateral for one of the loans and was now technically at risk. There were unpaid obligations to suppliers going back 18 months. The wealth my parents displayed, the cars, the house, the generous hosting of family events, was not built on a solid foundation. It was built on credit. And the credit was running out. Their wealth, the thing they used to command respect and exercise control, was mostly an illusion held together by timing and reputation. The more I understood about my parents' finances, the more I understood about my parents. They were not wealthy people sharing from abundance. They were people managing a careful performance of wealth, and that performance required certain things to function. It required people who believed in it. It required children who stayed close enough to be pointed to as evidence of their success. Look at my children. Look at what I built. It required financial dependency, because a child who needs their parents cannot look too carefully at what their parents actually have. A child who needs their parents will not ask hard questions. A child who needs their parents will remain grateful, compliant, and present. The system was not designed to make us successful. It was designed to make us need them. Femi was 34 and still asking my father's permission before making major decisions. Amaka was 28 and had turned down a job offer in another city because my mother had cried for 3 days at the suggestion of her leaving. I had watched both of these things happen and felt sad for my siblings without fully understanding what I was watching. Now I understood. My parents did not build children who could fly. They built children who believed the nest was the whole world. I had started to fly. That was the real problem. I want to tell you what rebuilding looked like from the inside because it was nothing like the way people imagine it. There were no dramatic announcements. No social media posts about my journey or my growth or my healing. No calls to relatives explaining my side of the story. No confrontations. No closure conversations. There was just work. I had my job, which I was good at. I began taking on additional freelance accounting projects in the evenings and on weekends, building a small but growing second income stream. I moved to a smaller apartment temporarily, not because I was struggling, but because I wanted to reduce my expenses and redirect money with more intention. I opened 2 new accounts at a different bank, both in my name only, both with passwords and security questions that no one in my family could guess. I started keeping records of everything, every income, every expense, every transaction. Not because I was afraid, but because I had learned the hard way that clarity about money is a form of protection. I told none of this to anyone in my family. I told very little of it to anyone at all. Silence had been used against me as a weapon when my parents used my absence to fill the space with lies. Now I was learning to use silence differently. As a shield. As a foundation. As the quietest kind of power there is. My parents, meanwhile, were building a story. Zara kept me informed, not regularly, just occasionally, when something particularly significant made its way through the family network. From what she shared, and from what I was able to observe through the edges of social gatherings I no longer attended, my parents were using my silence with great skill. My absence was presented as evidence of my guilt. My refusal to respond to the narrative was described as shame. My lack of contact was framed as abandonment. At one family event, my mother reportedly told a gathering of relatives that I was not doing well, that the choices I had made after leaving had left me isolated and struggling, that she prayed for me daily, even though I had broken her heart. People who heard this felt sorry for her. They also felt confirmed in their opinion of me. This is something I had not fully understood before. That silence in the wrong framing can be made to look like confession. That a person who says nothing can be made to look like a person who has nothing to say in their defense. My parents were skilled at framing. They had been doing it for years inside the family and now outside it. They were using my absence to fill the spaces with a version of me that suited their narrative. And they were profiting from it socially in sympathy and in status. The first crack appeared on a Wednesday afternoon in the 7th month after the family meeting. I heard about it through Zara, who actually called, which was unusual, rather than sending a text. Something is happening with Uncle Baidan's account, she said, using the name the family used for my father. There are people calling the house. Not friends. Not relatives. Official-sounding calls. I asked her what kind of calls.
She paused.
The kind that come when money is owed, she said carefully. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated her letting me know. I did not express satisfaction or surprise. I simply noted the information and placed it alongside everything else I already knew. What was happening was predictable if you understood the structure underneath the performance. My father's business had been managing its debt through a combination of new loans covering old ones and the expectation of income that had not materialized as planned. That kind of structure does not collapse all at once. It develops cracks. Small ones first. A delayed payment here. A declined request there. And then the creditors, who had been patient because they believed in the performance, began to look more carefully at the reality behind it. A financial rumor had started moving through the business community my father operated in. Once a rumor like that starts, it rarely stops on its own. By the 8th month, the cracks had become fractures. Zara's updates became more frequent. Not because she was gossiping. Zara was not that kind of person, but because what was happening inside the family home had become impossible to ignore, and she seemed to feel, in her quiet way, that I deserved to know the truth even if no one else thought so. My father had approached Femi for money. Not a small amount. A significant sum, framed as a temporary loan, a family-helping family situation, presented with the same confident language my father used for everything. Femi had given what he could, which was not enough, and the conversation had apparently ended with tension that the family had never experienced before because in our family, my father did not ask. He provided. He commanded. He decided. Watching him ask was, by all accounts, deeply unsettling for everyone present. My mother had taken to calling relatives she had not spoken to in years. The calls were framed as social, as catching up, as family warmth. But they always turned, eventually, toward need. The controllers were now discovering what it felt like to need something they could not simply take. The tension inside the house was growing. Siblings who had spent their whole lives operating under clear instructions now found themselves in a situation where the instructions no longer came from a place of strength. And a family that had been built on the management of dependence was beginning to feel the weight of its own structure. 9 months after the family meeting, my mother called me. I saw her name on my screen and sat with it for 3 full rings before I answered. Not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to enter the conversation from a place of steadiness rather than reaction. "Nora," she said. Her voice was different. Not soft exactly. My mother's voice was rarely soft, but smaller, like something that had been let out of a container that was too tight. "Mama," I said. "It has been a long time," she said. "It has," I agreed. There was a pause. I did not fill it. "I think," she said finally, "that we should talk. Sit together. You know how these things are. Family is family. Whatever happened, we are still your parents." I noticed several things about this statement. It acknowledged time had passed without acknowledging why. It invoked family without mentioning the specific events that had fractured it. It suggested reconciliation without containing a single word that resembled accountability. There was no sorry. There was no acknowledgement of the account. There was no mention of the story that had been told about me to relatives across the family network for 9 months. There was only the suggestion that we should talk. And underneath that suggestion, though she had not yet said it directly, was something else entirely. A need she had not yet named, but that I could already hear, waiting just behind her words. 3 days after my mother's call, my father sent a message through my Uncle Deli, one of his brothers, a man I had always respected for his quietness and his fairness. Uncle Deli called me on a Saturday morning. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they have been asked to carry a message they did not write. "Your father wants to find a way forward," he said. "He is asking if you would be willing to come back into the fold, to restore the relationship." I asked Uncle Deli what restoration would look like, specifically. There was a brief silence. Then he said, reading, I suspected, from something he had been given, "Your father would welcome your return to the family. He would welcome your support during this period. He believes that a child who truly loves their parents demonstrates that love in practical ways." I sat with that for a moment. Practical ways. After 9 months of being publicly named a thief and an abandoner, after 9 months of a narrative built specifically to damage my reputation and justify their actions, after the account, after the meeting, after the silence they had chosen and maintained until the silence stopped serving them. The reconciliation they were offering was conditional. The condition was money. After everything, love still had a price tag. And the price had simply changed hands. I gave Uncle Deli my answer the same day. I did not take time to craft it. I did not consult anyone or write out options or spend the night deciding. The answer was already clear inside me, had been clear, I think, from the moment I heard the word practical come through the phone. "Tell my father," I said, keeping my voice even and warm, "that I wish him and my mother well. I hope things improve for them. But I won't be providing financial support. That decision is final. Uncle Deli was quiet for a moment. Is there anything else you want me to tell him? He asked. No, I said. That's everything. We said goodbye. I put the phone down. And the feeling that moved through me in the moments after that call was not triumph or satisfaction or the particular pleasure of revenge. It was something simpler and more solid than any of those things. It was the feeling of a person who knows exactly where they stand, who does not need to explain themselves, who does not need to be understood by the people trying to diminish them. My silence after that call was not the silence of someone with nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had said exactly enough, and who understood, perhaps for the first time completely, that restraint is not weakness. It is the quietest kind of power there is. The image my parents had built over decades was not something that collapsed overnight, but it was something that, once it started shifting, shifted in ways that could not be controlled or reversed by the usual tools, by a well-placed comment, by a family meeting, by the careful management of who knew what and when. Because the tools that had always worked required one thing above everything else. They required people to believe in the performance. And performances, once examined closely enough, become difficult to maintain. Relatives who had once attended my parents' gatherings with enthusiasm began attending with less frequency. Invitations that once generated immediate responses now generated delays and polite excuses. The business community my father had moved through with confidence was now aware of the rumors, and awareness changes the temperature of a room. My father, who had sat at the head of every gathering and spoken with the authority of a man whose position was unquestioned, now sat in that same chair and felt the quality of the attention around him change. It is a specific kind of pain, I imagine, to feel your authority thin out in real time, to sense the respect becoming performance, the same way your love had always been. My mother, who had built her identity around being the woman married to a powerful man and mother to accomplished children, found that identity increasingly difficult to inhabit. Fear had moved into the house where pride used to live. The siblings shifted quietly, the way things shift when there is no dramatic announcement, but the ground underneath has changed. Femi called me 11 months after the family meeting. It was the first time he had called since that Sunday. His voice carried the particular discomfort of a person who has realized something late and is not sure how to acknowledge the lateness. I should have called sooner, he said. It was not quite an apology, but it was something. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me things I already knew about the financial situation, and a few things I didn't, specific numbers, specific creditors, specific conversations he had witnessed between my parents that had made him understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that the version of events the family had been told was not the version that had actually occurred. They said you stole from the account, he said at one point, his voice careful. I know what they said. I told him. I didn't fully believe it, he said. But I didn't say anything. I let that sit without filling it. I know, I said eventually. Amaka reached out 2 weeks later, through a voice note, which was more her style. She didn't explain herself or apologize either. She just said, I'm sorry I didn't check on you. The family narrative was fracturing, not loudly, but permanently. In the 12th month, the hidden debts became unhideable. The property in the village, the land that had been referred to at every family gathering for as long as I could remember as the family's foundation, the thing that will always be there, was formally flagged by the lending institution that held it as collateral. Proceedings had begun. The process was not yet final, but it was started, and these things, once started, follow their own logic. 2 of my father's business suppliers filed formal complaints about unpaid invoices. These complaints were not quiet. They moved through the business community, the way information moves when it has been suppressed for long enough, quickly, and with the particular energy of a truth that has been waiting to be told. A car was repossessed on a Tuesday morning from the driveway of the family house by men with clipboards and a truck. Neighbors watched. A child on the street asked her mother what was happening. The mother answered quietly and did not look away. The empire, if it could be called that, had never been an empire. It had been a careful arrangement of borrowed things positioned to look like owned ones. And now the arrangement was coming apart in the most visible possible way. In public. In front of the people whose opinion had always mattered most to my parents. In front of the audience their entire performance had been built for. My parents responded to the exposure the way people respond when the thing they have been managing finally becomes unmanageable. They looked for somewhere to put the blame that wasn't themselves. The economy was mentioned frequently. This country, my father said, according to Femi, at least once a day, as though the country had personally arranged the unpaid loans and the angry suppliers. Global events were referenced. The behavior of specific business partners was examined and found wanting. A relative who had given advice that had not worked out was quietly identified as partially responsible. Everyone and everything was a contributing factor. My father's decisions, the loans taken, the collateral offered, the expansion attempted on a foundation that could not support it, were not on the list. My mother's management of the family narrative, the months of stories told about me, the account that had been emptied, the formal disowning conducted in front of witnesses, none of this appeared in their accounting of what had gone wrong. I was mentioned occasionally, obliquely, as someone who had abandoned the family in its time of need. The cause of the crisis was never the decisions made inside it. The cause was always something that had come from outside. Always someone else. Always anything but the mirror. Desperation has a way of making people very certain that they are the victim of their own story. In the 14th month, they stopped using intermediaries. My mother called directly on a Sunday evening. I answered after 2 rings. She did not begin with family is family this time. She began with my name, said in a way that carried the full weight of 14 months without saying any of it. Nora. We're struggling. You know what is happening. You have heard. I said I had heard some things. We need help, she said. Just that. Plain and direct in a way my mother had rarely been in my entire life. We need financial help. From you. You are our child. I noticed that the demand was gone. The language of conditions and expectations and practical demonstrations of love, all of it had been replaced by something rawer and more honest than anything I had heard from her in years. She was not performing now. She was asking. And there was something almost heartbreaking about it, not because it made me want to give what she was asking for, but because I could see, clearly and without anger, how far things had traveled from where they had begun. The woman who had sat in that living room 14 months ago and told me I would regret my silence was now sitting somewhere in that same house, in a quieter version of that same silence, hoping I would end mine. Power had reversed so completely it had become almost unrecognizable. They tried guilt next because guilt had always been their most reliable instrument. It came through different channels over the following weeks. A voice note from my mother recounting specific memories, my childhood, things she had done for me, sacrifices that had never been named before but were now named in detail. A message from my father, typed and formal, listing what he described as his contributions to my life. School fees, food, shelter, opportunity. We raised you, he wrote. We gave you everything you needed to become who you are. You owe us. I read everything. I listened to everything. And I noticed something important. The memories they chose were real. The sacrifices in their way were real. My parents had fed me and housed me and paid for my education. These things had happened. I did not deny them or erase them. But I also noticed that every memory they offered was presented as a debt I had not yet repaid rather than a gift that had already been given. That every sacrifice was an invoice. That the love they described, when they described it, always came attached to what it had cost them rather than what it had meant to them. And I noticed something else. The old triggers, the guilt, the obligation, the fear of being the bad daughter, the ungrateful one, rose up in me briefly, the way old habits do when they're given the right signal. But they rose up and then they passed. Like weather. They no longer had anywhere to land. Let me tell you who I was at the 14-month mark because it matters to this story. I was financially stable in a way I had never been during the years I was connected to my parent system. My freelance income had grown to the point where it matched my salary. I had moved back into a comfortable apartment, not extravagant, but genuinely mine, furnished with things I had chosen and paid for without anyone's involvement. I had savings, real ones, in accounts that existed only in my name, protected by my decisions alone. I had built a small professional network of people who knew me through my work and through nothing else, people whose opinion of me was based entirely on what I did and how I operated, not on a narrative constructed in a family WhatsApp group. I was not healed in the simple, finished sense that people sometimes mean. I still had moments of grief, for the parents I had believed in, for the family I had thought I was part of, for the version of love I had spent 31 years trying to earn and had never quite managed to collect. But I was whole. Quietly, solidly, undramatically whole. And when I looked back at the woman who had sat in that living room with her hands folded in her lap, saying nothing while her father erased her name from the family record, I understood finally what she had known even then. That she was not the one who should have been afraid. The full truth came to me not in a single moment but in layers, the way understanding usually arrives when you have given it enough space to develop properly. The last layer settled into place on a quiet Tuesday evening when I was reviewing some old messages, not out of pain, but out of the kind of clear-eyed reflection that becomes possible when enough time and distance have accumulated. I had spent 14 months believing, on some level, that the disowning had been about money. That if I had given what they asked, or given it differently, or framed my refusal differently, the outcome might have been different. That the specific financial disagreement was the specific cause of the specific rupture. But sitting with the full picture, the account emptied before the meeting, the narrative built immediately after, the conditions attached to every offer of reconciliation, the guilt deployed when conditions failed, I saw something I had been circling for months, without quite landing on. They did not disown me because I refused to give money. They disowned me because I had stopped being someone they could predict. I had started asking questions. I had started making my own financial decisions without consulting them. I had started building things that existed outside their reach and their knowledge. I had become, in the language of the system I had grown up inside, unmanageable. Money was never the issue. Money was just the door they chose when they needed to close something. Control was always the issue. And I had stopped being controllable. In the weeks that followed the voice notes and the messages and the guilt and the appeals, something shifted in a way that required no announcement. They stopped. Not all at once. Gradually, the calls became less frequent. The intermediaries stopped calling. The messages spaced out and then stopped arriving. The last message from my father came on a Thursday, 3 short sentences, formal in the way that people become formal when they have exhausted the other registers, and after that, nothing. I think they understood, finally, what I had understood much earlier. That I could not be bought back. Not because I was bitter or cold or unforgiving. I had moved well past all of those things, but because the thing they were offering, the thing they called reconciliation and family and restoration, was the same arrangement with different packaging. Come back. Be visible. Be available. Be the kind of child that reflects well on us. And in return, in practical ways, support us. I was not interested in that arrangement. Not because I did not love them, in the complicated way that you can love people who have hurt you, but because I had learned, slowly and at real cost, the difference between love and management, between family and control, between belonging and being owned. Their authority, the kind that had shaped my decisions and my self-image for 3 decades, did not end in a confrontation. It ended quietly. The way things end when one side simply stops participating. I want to tell you how this story ends because it does not end the way these stories sometimes end in people's imaginations. I did not return. There was no dramatic reconciliation scene, no tearful embrace, no moment where everyone understood everything and the family was restored to something better than it had been. That is not the story. I did not fight. I did not pursue legal action over the account, though I had considered it. I decided that the cost, not financial, but personal, was not worth what I would recover. I had already recovered the more important thing. I did not beg. I did not explain myself to the relatives who had believed the story. I did not campaign for my own reputation in the spaces where it had been damaged. The people who knew me through my actions rather than through the narrative would form their own conclusions over time. The others would believe what they preferred to believe. I could not control that, and had stopped trying. I moved forward. That is the entire ending. Simple. Undramatic. Permanent. I wake up in my own apartment on mornings that belong entirely to me. I work at things I have chosen. I save money that no one can access. I have friendships built on who I actually am. I have, for the first time in my adult life, a relationship with myself that does not require anyone else's approval to feel real. My parents disowned me over money. I let the silence grow, because in that silence, I built a life they could no longer control.